Hello, my name's Gary Ford, Managing Director of Tiger Hobbies Limited, UK hobby importers and distributors, and welcome to Part 3, British Army Equipment and Leadership in the Early War Years. As stated earlier in the series, British factories did an incredible job of producing weapons for the British forces, especially the Army. Remember, on the 4th of June 1940, the British had evacuated over 300,000 troops from the beaches of Dunkirk, but all its heavy equipment and weapons were left behind. The Army had only one complete army division left, and that was in Egypt by the Suez Canal, and one fully equipped division of any sort in the UK, a newly arrived Canadian division. British factories would have to pull out all the stops to replace what we had lost, and by September 1940 most of the kit had been replaced and even some surplus to send to our forces overseas. The problem was it was equipment that had already in service, such as the 2-pounder anti-tank gun, the 25-pounder howitzer, Matilda tanks, joined by some of the newer cruiser tanks such as the Coventry tank, seen behind me, of which about 2,000 were knocked out by the factories in 1940, but was totally and utterly useless, never seeing a day's operational service as a gun tank. A few support vehicles saw service in Europe, and even a few saw service in the Pacific as bridge layers. The main bulk used as a training tank and home defence. One tank that was produced in massive numbers, over 8,000, was the Vickers Valentine tank, as you can see here by Tamaya. It seems that it was no better than earlier British tanks, but it was reliable, solid tank that saw service throughout the war in almost every theatre, especially by the Soviet Union, who absolutely loved it. Next to be on the table is a model of the 16 scale of the British Universal Carrier, sometimes known as the Brain Gun Carrier, the most produced military tracked vehicle in history, with over 100,000 built by British factories during the war. This was the maid of all the work for British and Commonwealth armies. You may find it odd, the British produced 3 of the finest anti-tank guns of the war, and one of these was the infamous 2-pounder gun. I can hear you now saying, oh no, 88mm is the best. Don't get me wrong, the 88mm was a great gun, especially in defence, and gave the British a hard time over the flat North African desert. But its downsides were, it was extremely massive, it was tall, had a crew of 10, pulled by some monstrous half-track, not exactly light and flexible. The British were developing the QF 6-pounder or 57mm before the war, but production delays and factory priority to get weapons back to the British Army ASAP saw the 6-pounder delayed until 1942. You need to compare the 2-pounder to the 37mm, or door knocker as it was known. The German 37mm had a velocity of 900 feet per second. The 2-pounder's velocity was 2,600 feet per second, a far superior weapon. After the 6-pounder was the massive 17-pounder AT gun, or anti-tank gun, seen behind me along with the 6-pounder and 2-pounder. But the 6-pounder overall was the best Western Allied anti-tank gun, coupled with the APDS, armour-piercing discarding sabot round, could and did take out Tiger tanks. It was lightweight as far as guns go. It could be towed behind anything with a hook, or, if desperate, moved by 6 to 8 men, or strap it between a couple of mules or donkeys. In one of my earlier videos, I talked about Britain fighting a war of machines and not a war of flesh, not willing to lose another 800 or 900,000 soldiers as we did in World War I. And the British did not matter how many tanks they lost. It was terrible to say, but it was 5 men in a tank, not hundreds of dead infantry in a field with letters going back home. British factories made sure we kept up with equipment losses, and it was the concept of machines over flesh that governed the way we fought during World War II, much to the dismay of the United States Army in 1944-1945. Britain produced a thick end of 30,000 tanks, plus another 30,000 armoured cars. As stated earlier, over 100,000 Bren gun carriers and almost 500,000 trucks, 125,000 artillery guns and the thick end of 130,000 combat aircraft of all types, plus a significant number that also came from the Commonwealth. Behind me is a person some may not be familiar with, that of Chief of the Imperial General Staff, or CIGS, General, later Field Marshal Alan Brooke, Churchill's right-hand man for most of World War II. Commissioned in 1902 in the Royal Artillery, he spent World War I in France with various artillery units, where he gained a reputation as a first-class artillery officer, helping to introduce the creeping barrage on the Somme. He ended World War I as a Lieutenant Colonel and Senior Artillery Staff Officer to the British First Army. It would be no accident that during the early part of World War II, especially North Africa, British artillery was highly respected, even by Rommel, who stated on a number of occasions, "I have beaten the British only at the last moment to be hammered by their excellent artillery so they could get away." At the start of World War II, Lieutenant General Brooke commanded 2 corps in France, and one of his subordinate senior officers was no other than Major General Montgomery, commanding the 3rd Infantry Division. Brooke was not impressed by senior army leadership in France, especially General Gort. Brooke predicted that the Allies, advancing along the Meuse, would let the Germans outflank them, and that's exactly what happened. But Brooke was dismissed as a defeatist by the British High Command. During the Dunkirk battles, Brooke distinguished himself by holding the line, making sure the evacuation was more secure. And in one move, he tasked General Montgomery in plugging the left flank after the collapse of the Belgian army. Handing over 2nd Corps to Montgomery, he was ordered back to the UK to take over 2nd BEF, British Expeditionary Force, which he was not really happy about. He thought the Battle of France was over. And in fact, the 2nd BEF did not last long, and Brooke convinced Churchill to withdraw the BEF and its over 200,000 soldiers. In one incident during the 2nd evacuation was the most infamous British maritime disaster, possibly 3 to 5 times the size of the Titanic's disaster. Now, the Titanic lost about 1,500 people. His Majesty's troop ship Lancastria, during the 2nd evacuation, was overloaded well beyond maritime law. Nobody knows to this day how many went down, as the aircraft was hit by, I think, JU88 dive bomber aircraft, sinking the ship literally within about 15 minutes. They think, the French say, minimum 4,000 went down. Other numbers put it as high as 6,000. So, back in the UK, Brooke commanded the UK Home Forces to plan for the potential German invasion. He went for a mobile reserve rather than fixed position. He also intended to use chemical weapons on the beaches against the Germans. By late 1941, Brooke was appointed Chief of the Imperial General Staff on Churchill's recommendation. Churchill was impressed by the fact that Brooke was in no way a yes man and had fighting spirit, very similar to the relationship between General George C. Marshall and Franklin Delano Roosevelt. One general officer who did benefit from the appointment of Brooke as CIGS was Montgomery, who impressed Brooke by his handling of the 3rd Division during the critical times at Dunkirk. Montgomery was a bit of a divisive officer, and Brooke on more than one occasion had to pull him out of the fire, including the infamous sexual disease quotes that upset all and sundry. Some of this could go back a little earlier, when his beloved wife died of an infection in 1937, leaving him absolutely distraught and throwing himself into his work. His extreme single-mindedness and his intolerance of others in the end was overlooked by Churchill and Brooke, and Montgomery, for all his faults, was prepared to fight and fight hard, and in a war, that's exactly what you need.